Let's talk about logistics now. It's all very well if Africa is going to be growing at some fairly glamorous GDP rates over the next decade or so, which is most people's contention. But what if the goods and services that Africa is producing cannot be transported around the continent and out of the continent, and we can't import stuff efficiently because of a lack of infrastructure, or also security risks on the infrastructure that we already have? In the studio with me now to discuss these matters is David Butler. David is the MD of Control Risk Group in Africa, and also we have Auden Mikkelsen, who's the MD of Afro Marine. David, Auden, thanks very much for joining me. David, I can start with you if you don't mind. Let me read about your panel that you're going to be on at the conference here in Cape Town. Terrorists by land, pirates by sea in Africa, it says. Speakers will discuss to what extent escalating security risks in transporting break, bulk and project cargo are actually becoming barriers to trade, as well as how to mitigate these threats to the region's supply chain. We all know about the Somalian piracy situation. My colleague in Johannesburg, Alicia Seckham, did an interview on that just a couple of days ago. Yes. But is it more widespread than that?
Well, first of all, let's put it in context. It's a positive picture. So we're seeing phenomenal growth across the continent and demand for goods across the continent. And what that's highlighted is, as you pointed out, a significant risk around infrastructure. So what we find, particularly around Africa, is goods are transported primarily by sea. Or waterways. The infrastructure inshore is challenging at best, and usually goods to project sites are transported by trucks. So the security risks that are highlighted, that comes to fore, is that of piracy and maritime security. And we know about Somalia, but we're also seeing a growth in maritime security risks on the west coast, which of course is where a lot of the natural resources that is driving Africa's growth is located. So we're seeing an increase in a range of risks from what's called anchorage crime, which is basically a ship anchors and is robbed. Criminals get on board and steal personal belongings.
So it shifted from east to west, from one coast to the other?
Yes, but they're very different. They're very different models. The Somalia piracy model is driven by an onshore problem in Somalia, which is effectively a failed state, and the inability of the Somalian government, what it is, to control its own territory. On the west coast, you've got a range of countries around the Gulf who have the right institutions, who have legitimate governments and working security forces. It's a very different situation. It's around criminal gangs, and it's around corruption and driven by the natural resources.
We'll come to that in more detail later on. Let's bring you into this one, Auden, if you can, talking about the West Coast as we are. Let me talk about the panel that you're going to be a part of, port developments in West Africa. Booming oil, mining infrastructure and also power generation sectors are transforming West Africa, it says here, into a major destination for project cargo. Speakers will discuss the latest port development projects on tap and hurdles that may hamper successful completion. Now, if we just broaden this from West Africa to the whole continent, the last time I looked, that we had a big coastline, and I just wonder what the state of the port development is, or port infrastructure is, on the whole continent. Are we underdeveloped or undeveloped?
I must say that I'm an optimist. Things are going absolutely in the right direction, and we can't expect that everything happens overnight. So I'm positive. We identified 4 main factors basically influencing all the ports. We have the port facilities, access to the hinterland, the people working in the port, and the legal framework. And these 4 factors are not just for Africa, they are valid for all ports around the world. But these factors are factors which could make a huge impact to the industry, because as you all know, the port lies at the heart of the logistics supply chain. Without the port functioning, the countries won't function as well. Of
course, we've got a company in this country listed on the JSE Securities Exchange called Grindrod, which has developed a port in Mozambique, and they're terribly excited and have always been about the potential for maybe similar projects in the rest of Africa. Are we falling behind though, and to the detriment of economic growth?
Yeah, well, again, I would say that I'm an optimist. I see great changes are happening, especially in West Africa. I talked about West Africa during the panel this morning, And I feel that the operators of mines, the operators of oil fields are taking great responsibility in improving the situation. And one point I think we should focus on is, of course, the human factor, because we can't expect again that things will change, that huge ports are built, that they are dredged, that the access to the hinterland is changed overnight. But what we all can do is to focus on the human factor, give people better training, not only the people in Africa, but also the people outside Africa who are dealing with Africa, because many people have this perception of what Africa is without even having been here.
Well, the training story is a familiar one, not just in the infrastructure development and sector, but everywhere in Africa. David, back to you now, back to the specific story of piracy. It must be lucrative, despite the fact that it has been well known for years, and despite the fact we hear about private companies coming from overseas and trying to sort out the problem with little private naval fleets and things like that. It must be lucrative, the fact that it's gone from east to west.
Just reiterate, it's not gone from east to west. The piracy in the Gulf of Guinea has been around since the beginning of the 2000s, and it's a very different model. It's driven by natural resources, and and the other factors that we all know when we talk about Nigeria and West Africa, endemic corruption, and a market for effectively a supply chain, so to speak, for the stolen goods. So there's a market for fuel. There are lots of refineries, illegal refineries around the country that can take oil and refine it and sell it on the black market. So there, the challenges that we face there. But it is a positive picture. And just going back to the piece about falling behind, natural resources drives to a certain extent, but goods are being sold on the continent and transported across the continent from manufacturers all the way through to the extractive projects. And it's driven as well. We just had the BRICS conference in Durban. And so you've got some fast growing economies around the world with their eyes looking at Africa for being not just a natural resources extraction, but also somewhere where they can sell goods. Food, water, as well as resources.
So when you speak to international investors or international potential stakeholders, it's a positive picture you're putting out. You're saying, yes, there is piracy, there has always been piracy, yes, there is a slight risk to the supply chain, but on the other hand, we're on top of it and it will get better.
Yes, I mean, it's a balance. There are more companies very interested in investing in across the continent. And bear in mind, 54 countries, very different countries with risks. But everybody's looking at Africa as the next big growth market. So the infrastructure investment needs to keep up with that challenge of business coming into the country. And it's a balance. I'm not entirely optimistic because large infrastructure projects need strong institutions and politics. And we can look at a number of countries across the continent where the political risk is quite high, and therefore infrastructure development there is going to be dodgy at best. Yeah. So it is a challenge, but it's a broadly positive view, and I'm an optimist like my colleague.
Let's talk about ports again, if we would, Auden, because I remember years and years ago the Chinese going to Brazil and wanting Brazilian soybeans. I think it was about 30 years ago, and they said they were innovative. They said, we'd like your soybeans, but we'll help you build a port specifically to export these soybeans to our ports. What's the model in Africa? Whose responsibility is it to build the port? Is it a private public partnership? How does it work?
Yeah, normally it's a private public partnership, and of course Africa is a huge continent, and it's impossible to say how things are working in all the ports because it differs. I feel that trading companies often take an important part in constructing the ports, especially, for example, in Liberia, Sierra Leone, where there was nothing basically, and these companies take huge responsibility.
But the government, of course, needs it because it's a strategic resource, if you like.
Absolutely.
So they have to have some stake.
There is some kind of joint venture. Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, what is your company doing as we wrap up with you? What was the message that came out of your panel this morning?
Well, I can say that Afro Marine is a ship broker, ship agency service provider. We're working dry bulk, that are minerals, out of Africa, and we are working project cargoes into Africa. As a ship agency service provider, we try to work in the ports we are calling with our vessels. I think the result or the conclusion of the panel today was basically that things look good. We're talking about projects in Africa worth billions, so we should be happy. Challenges are there, but they have been identified. Authorities are doing a great job rebuilding the port facilities, getting better access to the hinterland, making the legal framework easier. And now we can all focus on our own organizations by making management and operations work more smoothly, by focusing on the human factor, by giving better training.
Good. Gentlemen, thanks very much for coming in. Sorry, David, I couldn't get a sort of summary from you, but just to say you are optimistic.
We are, yes, but just know your countries, do your risk assessments, and as control risks, that's how we help our clients.